The tent was filled with the smell of incense, old blood, and terror. Outside, the heavy, rhythmic footsteps of the executioner were getting closer. Inside the tabernacle of the Lord, a man was clinging to the horns of the bronze altar. His knuckles were white. His hands, usually steady with a sword, were trembling. These were hands that had toppled cities, hands that had held the crown of a king, hands that were stained with the blood of enemies and friends alike. He was the most feared man in Israel, the invincible general, the right hand of King David. His name was Joab. And now he was an old man, cornered like a wild animal in the very sanctuary he had spent a lifetime ignoring. He shouted, "I will die here." He hoped the holiness of the place would save him. He hoped that his lifetime of service, the wars won, the rebellions crushed, the dirty work he did so the king could keep his hands clean would count for something. But as the shadow of the executioner fell across the tent floor, Joab realized a terrifying truth. You can spend your whole life building God's kingdom without ever knowing God's heart. The sword was raised. The end had come. But to understand how the greatest general in Israel's history ended up slaughtered next to the holy altar, we have to go back. We have to go back to the caves, to the wilderness, to the moment the steel entered his soul. Joab wasn't born in a palace. He was forged in the fire of rejection. He was the son of Zeruiah, King David's sister. This made him David's nephew, though they were likely close in age. Growing up, Joab didn't see the shepherd boy who sang psalms. He saw the outlaw. He saw David, the fugitive, running from King Saul. Joab, along with his brothers Abishai and Asahel, joined David in the cave of Adullam. Picture the scene. The distress, the debt, the discontent. 400 desperate men hiding in the cracks of the earth. This was Joab's seminary. He didn't learn theology. He learned survival. He watched David navigate the treacherous politics of the wilderness. He saw that for David to survive, someone had to be the shield. Someone had to be the sword. David was the poet. Joab became the pragmatist. David looked at the stars and saw the glory of God. Joab looked at the shadows and saw assassins. From the very beginning, Joab developed a fierce, unbreakable loyalty to David. But it wasn't a spiritual loyalty. It was tribal. It was blood. He decided early on that he would do whatever it took to make David king, even if it meant losing his own humanity in the process. But the wilderness was just the training ground. The real test was about to begin. King Saul fell on Mount Gilboa. The throne was empty. But Israel didn't instantly bow to David. The nation was fractured. David was crowned king of Judah. But the rest of Israel followed Saul's son, Ishbosheth. Civil war erupted. And at the center of the storm stood Joab. The defining moment of his early career happened at the Pool of Gibeon. It was supposed to be a diplomatic standoff. Two armies facing each other across the water. Abner, the commander of Israel's army, challenged Joab to a contest. 12 men from each side. It turned into a massacre. Blood turned the water red. The contest became a battle, and Abner's forces broke and ran. Joab's younger brother, Asahel, fast as a wild gazelle but lacking in wisdom, chased after the seasoned General Abner. Abner warned him, "Turn aside, Asahel. Don't make me kill you. How could I face your brother Joab?" But Asahel wouldn't listen. He wanted the glory. With a backward thrust of his spear, Abner struck Asahel dead. Joab arrived at the scene moments later. He looked down at the broken body of his little brother. The grief was instant. But just as quickly, the grief hardened into something cold and heavy. Bitterness. And here we find a lesson that echoes into our lives today. Grief, when surrendered to God, can soften the heart. But grief, when fueled by vengeance, becomes a fortress. Joab didn't take his pain to the Lord. He filed it away. He let the root of bitterness grow deep. How often do we do the same? We call it justice, but God calls it a poison that will eventually consume us. The war dragged on, but the tide was turning. Abner, realizing David was destined to win, decided to defect. He came to David in peace. David accepted him. He gave him a feast. He let him go in peace. David showed mercy. But Joab was furious. "What have you done?" he shouted at the king. "He came to deceive you. He is a spy." But it wasn't just about security. It was about the blood debt. Joab sent messengers to drag Abner back. He met him at the gate of Hebron, a city of refuge where killing was forbidden. He pulled Abner close, pretending to whisper a secret. And then he drove a blade into Abner's stomach. Murder. In cold blood. David was horrified. He cursed Joab. He wept for Abner. He made everyone see that he had no part in this treachery. But notice this. David did not fire him. Why? Because David needed a killer. The kingdom was fragile, and Joab was effective. This was the dynamic that would haunt their relationship for 40 years. Joab was the necessary evil, the man who did the dirty work so the king could keep his conscience clean. But something unexpected was about to happen, a moment that would cement Joab's power forever. David wanted Jerusalem. The Jebusites held the fortress of Zion. They mocked David, shouting down from the high walls, "Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." The walls were too high. The slopes were too steep. It was impossible. David made a decree. Whoever strikes the Jebusites first shall be chief and commander. He threw down the gauntlet. He needed a hero. Joab looked at the walls. He didn't see an obstacle. He saw an opportunity. He found the one weakness: a water shaft, a vertical tunnel cut through solid rock, slick with slime and moss, leading up into the city. Imagine the grit. Joab, stripping off his armor, climbing hand over hand up the dark, wet chimney. One slip meant death, his breath echoing in the stone throat of the earth. He pulled himself up into the heart of the city, drew his sword, and opened the gates. Jerusalem fell. David had his capital, and Joab had his job. He was now the commander of the host of Israel. He was the second most powerful man in the kingdom. He was efficient, he was brilliant, he was loyal. But loyalty to a leader is not the same as surrender to God. As the years passed, Joab became the architect of Israel's military dominance. He crushed the Edomites. He subdued the Ammonites. He fought in the mud, the heat, and the blood, while David sat on the throne. He began to feel that he was the one holding the kingdom together, and that pride makes a man dangerous. Then came the spring when kings go out to war. Joab was at the front lines, besieging the city of Rabbah. He was sleeping in a tent, eating rations, fighting the king's battles. David was in Jerusalem, sleeping in a palace, walking on the roof. We know the story. Bathsheba, the adultery, the pregnancy, the panic. David tried to cover it up. He called Uriah the Hittite back from the war. But Uriah was a man of honor. He wouldn't sleep in his soft bed while his comrades were in the field. So David wrote a letter. Set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, and retreat from him, that he may be struck down and die. David sealed it and gave it to Uriah to carry to Joab. When Joab opened that scroll, what did he think? He read the order. It was murder. It was a betrayal of one of his best soldiers, a member of the elite, mighty men. Uriah had fought beside Joab for years. But Joab didn't hesitate. He didn't send a letter back saying, "My king, fear God." He didn't ride to Jerusalem to confront David. He simply calculated the logistics. He sent Uriah to the wall. He pulled back support. Uriah died. This moment is terrifying. It teaches us that when we idolize a leader, we will eventually inherit their corruption. Joab had spent so long serving David that he had no moral compass of his own. If David wanted a man dead, the man died. It didn't matter if it was right. It only mattered if it was ordered. Listen closely. You cannot be a yes man to leadership and a servant of God at the same time. Eventually, the orders will conflict. Joab chose his king over his God, and in doing so, he became a partner in the darkest stain on David's legacy. Joab sent word to David, "Uriah is dead." The transaction was complete. They were now bound together not just by blood, but by a shared secret, a shared sin. But the consequences of that sin were about to tear the family apart. Years later, chaos erupted in David's house. Amnon raped Tamar. Absalom murdered Amnon. Absalom fled into exile. David was heartbroken, missing his son, but refusing to act. He was paralyzed by his own past failures. Joab saw the instability. He knew a kingdom couldn't survive with an estranged heir. So, Joab manipulated the situation. He hired a wise woman to tell a story that tricked David into bringing Absalom back. Joab was the bridge builder. He brought Absalom back to Jerusalem. But then, Absalom, arrogant and entitled, wanted to see the king. David refused. So what did Absalom do? He set Joab's barley field on fire. Joab, pragmatic as always, didn't kill Absalom for this. He realized this young man had fire in him. He facilitated the meeting. He thought he was securing the succession. He was actually opening the door to hell. Absalom stole the hearts of the people. He launched a massive rebellion. David, the old lion, had to flee Jerusalem barefoot, weeping as he went up the Mount of Olives. Joab rode beside him. He must have been furious. He had built this kingdom. He had secured this city. And now, because David had been too soft as a father, they were running like fugitives again. The final showdown came in the wood of Ephraim. David gave one command to his generals: "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." Every soldier heard it. "Do not kill the son." The battle raged in the thick forest. The rebels were slaughtered. Absalom, riding his mule, got his heavy hair caught in the thick branches of a great oak tree. The mule kept going. Absalom was left dangling between heaven and earth. A soldier found him and ran to tell Joab. "I saw Absalom hanging in an oak." Joab looked at the soldier with contempt. "You saw him? Why didn't you strike him to the ground? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt." The soldier, showing more integrity than the general, replied, "Even if you gave me 1,000 shekels, I would not lift my hand against the king's son. We heard the command." Joab snarled, "I will not waste time with you." He took 3 javelins in his hand. This is the definitive Joab moment. He knew the king's heart. Save my son. But he decided that the king's heart was dangerous to the king's throne. Joab believed that as long as Absalom lived, the civil war would never end. He decided to save David from himself. He rode to the tree. He thrust the javelins into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. He blew the trumpet. The war was over. But here is the spiritual tragedy. Joab thought he knew better. He operated on the philosophy that the end justifies the means. He saved the kingdom, yes, but he broke the king's heart. In the kingdom of God, How we do things matters as much as what we do. We cannot build God's church using the devil's tools. We cannot secure peace through disobedience. When David heard the news, he didn't celebrate the victory. He collapsed. "Oh, my son Absalom! My son! My son Absalom!" The army tried to sneak into the city like beaten dogs. They were ashamed of their victory because the king was grieving. And this is where we see the grit of Joab. He marched into the king's chamber. The man who had just murdered the king's son now stood over the weeping father. "You have shamed this day the faces of all your servants who saved your life," Joab barked. "You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. If Absalom were alive and all of us dead, you would be pleased." It was harsh. It was cruel. But it was true. Joab forced David to get up, wash his face, and sit in the gate. He saved David's reign that day, but the relationship was shattered. David could never look at Joab the same way again. The blood of his son was on those hands. David tried to replace him. He appointed Amasa, Absalom's general, to replace Joab. It was a political move to heal the nation. Joab didn't accept retirement. During a mission to crush another rebellion, Joab met Amasa. He wore his military tunic, and a sword was strapped to his waist. As he walked, the sword accidentally fell out of its sheath. He picked it up with his left hand. With his right hand, he grabbed Amasa's beard to kiss him. "Is it well with you, my brother?" Amasa didn't see the sword in Joab's left hand. One strike. Gutted. Joab left him wallowing in his blood on the highway and continued the mission. He simply took command again. He proved that he was the only one who could lead, even if he had to kill his rivals to do it. He was unstoppable. He was the power behind the throne. But time comes for every man. David grew old and feeble. The question of succession arose again. Adonijah, David's oldest surviving son, decided to claim the throne. He was handsome. He had chariots. He was the traditional choice. And Joab backed him. Why? Why did Joab turn against David's wish for Solomon? Because Adonijah was a man of the world. He was a man of strength. Joab understood men like that. Solomon was a man of peace, a man of wisdom, a man who didn't need a ruthless general. Joab knew that in Solomon's kingdom, there was no place for a man like him. But they bet on the wrong horse. God had chosen Solomon. David rallied one last time to anoint Solomon as king. The shouts of "Long live King Solomon" echoed from the Gihon spring. Adonijah's banquet fell apart. The guests fled in terror. Joab heard the trumpet blast and asked, "Why is the city in an uproar?" When the news came, Joab knew it was over. The era of the sword was ending. The era of peace was beginning. And the man of war had nowhere left to go. Which brings us back to the tent, the horns of the altar. David, on his deathbed, had given Solomon a chilling instruction regarding Joab. Do not let his gray head go down to the grave in peace. David knew that Joab was a wild card, a man who killed when he wanted, who disobeyed when he saw fit. He was too dangerous to leave alive in a kingdom of peace. So Solomon sent Benaiah, the new commander. He found Joab clinging to the altar. "Come out," Benaiah ordered. "No," Joab cried, his voice raspy with age and desperation. "I will die here." He wanted to force Benaiah to commit sacrilege, to kill him in the holy place. It was one last manipulation, one last power play. Benaiah paused. He asked Solomon for instructions. Solomon's reply was cold justice. "Do as he has said. Strike him down and bury him. And there, in the shadow of the presence of God, the sword fell. The man who lived by the sword died by the sword. The blood he had shed caught up to him at last. Joab is one of the most tragic figures in the Bible. He is not a villain like Goliath or a traitor like Judas. He is something far more complex and far more common in our churches today. He is the loyal secularist. 1. You can work for God without walking with God. Joab spent his entire life fighting the Lord's battles. He furthered the kingdom. He protected the anointed king. But there is not a single record of Joab praying. There is no psalm of Joab. He was near the fire, but he never got warm. 2. Pragmatism is not piety. Joab always did what made sense. It made sense to kill Abner. It made sense to kill Absalom. It made sense to back Adonijah. But the kingdom of God often doesn't make sense. It requires obedience, not just strategy. When we rely on our own cleverness, we often cut across God's will. 3. Bitterness is a ticking time bomb. It started with his brother's death at Gibeon. Joab carried that grudge for decades until he got his revenge. He never forgave, and a heart that cannot forgive will eventually become a heart that cannot feel. 4. You cannot inherit someone else's relationship with God. Joab relied on his proximity to David. He thought being the king's nephew and the king's general gave him security. But God has no grandchildren. We must each stand before him ourselves. As we look at the life of Joab, let it be a mirror. Are we busy building the structure of the church, yet neglecting the altar of our own hearts? Are we fighting for the cause of Christ while ignoring the commands of Christ? Joab died holding on to the altar, but he didn't know the God of the altar. Don't let that be your story. Don't let your service outpace your surrender. Because in the end, God doesn't want your sword. He wants your heart. If this story of Joab made you think about the difference between religious activity and true relationship, I have a challenge for you. This week, stop fighting for a moment. Put down the work you are doing for God and spend 10 minutes just being with Him. If you want to dive deeper into the tragic family of David, click this video here on Absalom, the son who stole the hearts of the people but lost his own soul.